I'm Janaina from Security in Context and from the research track Class, Race and Gender and Insecurity. And I'm here with Amy Fallas to discuss a little bit of the Bukele's in El Salvador matter right now and how these can help us to understand a little bit the background of Latin America and crime and security, and also understand how his new policies play a role in the contemporary issues right now around the region. So I would like to invite our guest to present herself, and since the beginning say that we are very glad to have you here. And so a big thank you from all the Security in Context team.
Thanks so much for the warm invitation. And yeah, so my name is Amy Fallas, and I'm a Salvadoran-Costa Rican writer, editor, and historian. And currently I am adjunct professor of history at Santa Barbara City College and a PhD candidate in history at UC Santa Barbara. And more or less, it's interesting because my research actually focuses on the history of the modern Middle East, but I also do look at the connections between the Middle East and Latin America. And in regard to that latter focus, my work really explores the racialization of religion in Latin American contexts with regard to Middle Eastern migrants. And so the current project that I'm working on looks at the history of Palestinians in El Salvador during the 20th century, but into the present as well.
Okay, thank you. It's very interesting how you cross all the topics that actually are the most urgent and pressing topics at the moment, also in our discussions at Security in Context. And I think we're going to have a great discussion today. And I would like to start our conversation asking you a little bit about what is the background of the Bukele elections in El Salvador. And so if we can say that we had elections this year with his second term now starting in since February, where he declared himself president. So how can we understand this new configuration of state of emergency in El Salvador, and how and what leads to Bukele's election?
Absolutely. So I think that there are both sort of recent, within the past 5 to 10 years, historical trajectory of Bukele's rise, but then there's also kind of the longer durée approach to it. So I would say we can really see, we can go back as far as 50 years ago during the Salvadoran Civil War, because it is really this traumatic event that starts roughly around 1979 to 1980, up until the peace accords in 1992. That is a really traumatic period in El Salvador and creates a lot of mechanisms that both Bukele is responding to and utilizing, and is sort of also a reiteration of previous policies that were pursued in the aftermath of the Civil War. So, for instance, I would say that when the Civil War concluded, there was a effort to, well, I mean, this was basically, the Accords itself was to integrate the militant groups, both from the left and the right, into the political process, right? And so what this ends up setting up in El Salvador is that you have this very polarized political dynamic where you have, the legacy of the communist leftist groups in FMLN, and you have the conservative right-wing pro-militarization legacies of the Contras. And they're now all running for public office. And so you see years of this kind of back and forth, right, where one party becomes more dominant, the other one does. And eventually, I mean, what the Salvadoran people see is that they're losing out. And so it's interesting because Bukele's political career starts in his mayoral runs. And he very much, he starts actually with the leftists, the FMLN, but he starts to really lean into this idea of, I'm not like los mismos de siempre, the same people as always. I'm not going to give you this two, it's either this way or that way. I'm in the middle road. And people's fatigue with corruption, with this, with the political impasses of both the right and the left, sort of paved the way for people to be open and receptive to Bukele and to really want a candidate like this that, and then certainly within the context of his mayoral runs and then his first presidential run, we're in the age of Trump, we're in the age of Bolsonaro. I'm not an, establishment insider. And so that becomes sort of the backdrop to his first successful run in 2019. And this is before we really also have a firm understanding of what are the kind of policies he's going to pursue as a president.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think it's very interesting the point you brought about how also this discourse of polarization, but also this idea of a candidate that it is against the system or it's an outsider that would come to fix our problems. It's also a transnational situation in Latin America, but not just, and but I think I would like to hear you also about these, if we can say, differential about Bukele in terms of his policies around crime and security that are for sure not a new topic in the region, but and also all these mano dura are not something new, but the way he's doing it certainly has new implications. So how you see that?
Absolutely. So as we can see with the last election, that was the primary platform, right? Is we're tough on crime. We are zero tolerance in regard to any kind of gang involvement and participation. But this is not, again, it's definitely not new, and I'll go into that in a bit, but it's also not these were not the policies that gave him a rise back in 2019. He is looking certainly into cleaning up San Salvador, the capital, because he was the mayor there before he was the mayor of Nueva Cuscatlán. And the idea was to introduce kind of new ideas of, yes, we want to clean up San Salvador from crime, but it's also to make it economically prosperous. And actually, one of several of his primary policies when he first came to office in 2019 were kind of like erratic. Like again, we call him like the cool dictator. He calls himself the cool dictator, right? Or the millennial president, where he's taking selfies at the UN, saying we're a new El Salvador. He introduces Bitcoin. El Salvador becomes the first country in 2021 to introduce Bitcoin as legal tender. And he starts to create all these tourism initiatives based off of this kind of new cool veneer. And he even rebrands beaches. There's a beach he renames Bitcoin Beach. And so you can kind of see early on, he's trying to sort of reframe how El Salvador is seen. But that takes a really dark turn once you have these more or less national referendums on like how he's doing, which was the Bitcoin law and then the sort of midterm parliamentary elections. And you can kind of see how he starts to consolidate political power around his party. So he starts a new party called Nuevas Ideas. And Washington insiders have basically called it like gerrymandering to unprecedented levels. Before he begins this tough stance on gangs, he starts to consolidate power both in this manner, in like one party rule, but then also in the judiciary. So, there was that really kind of shocking image of he brings in the military when the assembly is about to vote on funding for security forces. It's seen, as a threat. He dismisses, of course, the more or less Supreme Court of El Salvador, and in addition with the position of Attorney General. So he's dismantling these institutions of rule of law. He's pushing forward one-party rule. And he's kind of using all these smoke screens to hide, all of these efforts. When in reality, we have just gone into, I think we're entering the 25th month of the state of emergency, which he starts in March of 2021. And part of that state of emergency was this notion of we're tough on crime. We are not going to tolerate gang intransience. But what's interesting about this is, and as a lot of Salvadoran observers, activists, and journalists have said, it was essentially a break in a kind of secret agreement between Bukele and the gangs, right? So this is not the first, he comes and suddenly, gang violence is decreasing and the homicide rate is declining. And a lot of people have shown proof that it is because he had an arrangement with these gangs. He paid off. That situation was unfavorable to those groups. He swung 180 and he's like, okay, we're going to go directly after you. And this is a policy that is more or less really popular, both in the diaspora and with Salvadorans in the country. And so there's that tension. And I think he's found this as sort of a linchpin issue that he can get away with violating the Constitution and introducing all these other authoritarian measures without much pushback.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting because of this change that you pointed from one policy of kind of building peace agreements with the gangs, no, like stopping a little bit the violence, business go well, and then we keep going, to this change of being no, this tough repression. But one thing I'm thinking is like his popularity is increasing at the same time as a discourse of efficiency of these policies, no? Like, so you have massive rates of incarceration and the violence reduces, and but at which costs, right? So how is this discussion around like the efficiency of his policies against the violation of human rights? And a complement to this question is we have seen many commentaries in other countries in the region like praising no, his policies, or discussing how and if this type of policies could be implemented in other countries and in Central America. Also, these discussions in Guatemala, Honduras. So how you see that, and how has this been discussed between scholars on the topic?
I mean, it's very interesting now because I think also Bukele has sort of branded himself. I mean, we hear like with what happened in Ecuador, like maybe they need a Bukele. Like that's a very jarring thing to hear, particularly because a lot of Salvadoran civil society, and in here I mean, human rights organizations, journalists, activists, El Salvador has a very active community in which the major critiques, there have been unprecedented coalitions amongst these groups because of what Bukele is doing. And they're pointing out all of kind of, you were saying, like, what's the trade-off? Like, is everyone actually okay with surrendering civil liberties in the interest of security and protection from gangs? And the reality is it is so much more than just the gangs that are suffering, right? Children have been arrested. At this point, 1.7% of the country's entire population is in jail, which is about 4 times the capacity that the system is capable of managing. And so I think what we're seeing is that in the short term, this of course sort of bolsters Bukele's bona fides, in that he is a man of his word, right? Indiscriminately, and also disappearances, and also we have instances of, we've seen mass graves. I mean, so there's, beyond the massive extent of incarceration, there's also clear violations of human rights that have occurred outside of that. So this state of emergency is really enabling impunity at levels we have not seen in a while. But as I mentioned, I think this is just a short-term solution, because as I mentioned, they're at beyond capacity. And as we've seen during the mano dura policies of the 90s and the 2000s, which was in the aftermath of the Civil War, this only fuels, these cycles of violence. And it's not thinking, in terms of restorative justice. There are no alternative models for how to deal with the issue of crime except to lock everyone away. And so I think it's a short-term payoff for a long-term entrenchment of a much bigger problem. And so, the El Salvador that he's trying to build in 10 to 15 years, what is that really going to look like, right? He's trying to introduce Bitcoin and mine energy from volcanoes, and then there's going to be an even greater security problem because of his inability to sort of see that. So I see the efficacy in terms of short-term gain, and there's never been really any long-term projections with most of the policies that he's put in place.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think there is many, many examples in the region of how these policies actually bring more, like how actually the gangs are even stronger, the criminal governance gets even stronger after a big, after a moment of tough repression. No? This is in Brazil, this is in many, many other countries in Latin America. And I think you again pointed out a very interesting point, how this connects also with other of his policies, as the Bitcoins or all this leisure paradise that El Salvador can become, and also like now these new policies of passport for skilled workers. So all these kind of creation of inequalities also inside. No, you repress inside and then you bring from the outside a new elite or things like that. And so my question then would be how this connects also with El Salvador foreign policy, especially in terms of the relationship with the US and all the interests of also US policy towards the crime repression on one hand, since also the biggest gangs also are connected with US territory. And a second point with the change of language from crime to this new complex terror prison that he's building. So has a change that really connects somehow, seems like, with the US policy also. So how you see that?
This is a great question, because it's one of the issues I think can really push Bukele in one way over the other, because the reality is the situation between El Salvador and the United States is kind of very intricately connected in ways that we can't ignore. And the first part of that is Bukele can, and he has in many instances said, oh, you know, I'm a big tough guy, like Joe Biden doesn't tell me anything, like we're independent. The reality is he needs to have good relations with the United States because a lot of the diaspora is based in the United States, and 25% of, or more or less, it usually oscillates around that point, of the GDP of El Salvador is based on remittances, right? So El Salvador is one of the countries that has the highest level of remittances for its economy. And this is also, I think, part of what he's trying to do is trying to divest by saying, oh yeah, we'll give 5,000 passports to the most, you know, intellectual, smart foreigners, i.e. Europeans, you know, to come in, because he wants to start thinking about like establishing those connections with foreigners in ways that don't perhaps implicate and tie him so closely to U.S. To the role of the U.S. in El Salvador. And to be fair, right, the policies of the U.S. in El Salvador have always been disastrous. And you know, I say this as the daughter of you know, immigrants and refugees who left during the Civil War. I see directly how that has unfolded, right? And so I don't necessarily think that Bukele is in a position to actually be completely isolationist, right? I don't think that that is an option. The problem is now, of course, with the US foreign policy, and we're talking about its detrimental effects in the country, they are also, I mean, we're potentially looking at another Trump administration. Biden also has not really shifted much, right, from the previous administration, you know, previous potentially future administration on the language of the securitization of the border, of, you know, you're right, he recently used the term illegals, and this is just, I mean, migrants. This isn't even the gang, you know, issue. I, you know, fear to see what he would say in his unfiltered way, what he really thought about that dynamic. And so it's not really, so obviously the US isn't helping, but I also think that Bukele is maybe a little bit has too much ego to kind of acknowledge that he can't afford to have a hyper isolationist position.
Yeah, definitely. I think there is a clear limit of how far he can go with this, right? And so this is a great overview of the Bukele and El Salvador context. And but you also mentioned it in the beginning, no? And you have an extensive work into the Middle East and also the relationship with Latin America. And well, Bukele comes from a Palestinian background, and in Latin America has been very prominent in terms of taking a side in terms of the conflict of Israel and Palestine, also very controversial between the different countries. But how is the position of Bukele, and how is this debate in El Salvador? Is this a matter in El Salvador at the moment, or not? Also because of the big internal context at the moment.
So this is, I think, perhaps for me in my research, like the most interesting question, because there are all of these tensions that are happening with Bukele as a third generation Palestinian Salvadoran, right? But then the country itself has one of the highest percentages of Palestinian descendant peoples in all of Latin America, sort of per capita. And a lot of those individuals are very pro-Palestinian. But it is also within a country that has recently seen a shift, particularly in the post-Civil War context, from a predominantly Roman Catholic country to a more Protestant orientation that is very much influenced by sort of the evangelical pro-Israel lobby globally. I mean, we see this anywhere from Africa to East Asia and the United States. I mean, you know, these evangelicals have really interesting ways of transferring those sort of policy positions, right? And so it's a very it's a growing evangelical country that is also very pro-Israel. And so there is this really interesting polarizing dynamic, even in terms of the current context of Israel's war on Gaza. But this didn't just start necessarily with the war. If you remember a couple years back, there were these very global protest demonstrations against the evictions of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem. And it was really interesting because during that time, it was generally seen as there was sort of a way of destigmatizing support for Palestine, even in places where it was very difficult to talk about that, because it was seen as there are these Palestinians, they're living there, they're being forcefully evicted. And Bukele, when this happened, was virtually silent. He did not say anything. And it was interesting because this was a moment where you could say, well, if you want to be a regional leader and you want to, let's say, leverage your identity as a Palestinian descendant Salvadoran, this is a great opportunity to do that. Because in the country itself, the community is very organized and they're very outspoken. And so the Palestinian Salvadoran community are the ones who organized demonstrations and protests. I remember this image that they posted. They have this group, and on their Facebook group, there was a man who had been born in Palestine before the creation of the state of Israel. He's now in El Salvador, and he's like there, like protesting, and it was just so, heartwarming. But then to contrast that with the virtual silence of Bukele has been, it was something very jarring and something that I think a lot of people picked up in globally, so not just in El Salvador. That has changed with the recent war. And what is interesting is that this is completely tied again to his notion of, you brought up the way that he's framing gangs as terrorists, right? I don't know if it was October 7th or the day after, but it was shortly after Hamas invaded, that he issued a public statement on Twitter, his favorite platform, or X now, I believe, and said what Israel needs to do, they should do everything that they possibly can against Hamas, because we're doing the same thing to address terrorists in El Salvador. So he's linking, he's only really engaging and putting his skin out there when it comes to contentious foreign policy stances when it benefits his own domestic interests and his consolidation of power. And so I've also written about this in a few different avenues about how he will leverage different aspects of his religious identities, because his wife has Sephardic Jewish origins, his father was the Muslim leader of El Salvador. He uses all of these different connections and identities and proximities to leverage, to politically leverage his standing. And so it's fascinating to watch. It's unfortunate that it's leading to a lot of detrimental policies for the average Salvadoran person. And a lot of family of mine in El Salvador have said, how jarring that has been.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating and sad at the same time because he's great on the marketing side of it, right? And I think also the episode you mentioned when he went with the military to the Congress to advocate. No, he was also always talking with this religious language in the name of God. We need to have patience. They will decide, but with the military together. So it's definitely a mixture of different signs, no? And I think just to finish and finish maybe in a more better spirit, I would like to hear from you how is also the opposition, the resistance in El Salvador and abroad towards his policies and human rights violation, and also at the same time, I think what comes from all of our conversation, it's a big crisis in Latin America in general around what is democracy and what we imagine as a political future for our region. No?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I will say, I really think that a lot of what I mentioned, like these Salvadoran activists they're doing amazing work. And I would actually say a group of people that have really been inspiring have been the staff at El Faro, which is perhaps the last, not the last, but like one of the independent news outlets in El Salvador, because they're doing work that really that has put a lot of them at risk. And they have uncovered a lot of, again, when we're looking for information to be able to critique the policies that we're seeing put in place, they're the ones that are really doing that legwork and saying, we actually found footage of this meeting that, a member from Nuevas Ideas was meeting with gangs and there was bribery involved, and they're doing all of this work. And they're, also suffering because of increased surveillance and targeting. For instance, Bukele, it was found that there was like Pegasus, software on the phones, on the staff computers. All of this Israeli surveillance technology is used to attack them and to perhaps stay one step ahead of the kinds of things that they're finding. But I think that they're really doing so much work and shedding a light on what's going on that a lot of other groups are using to mobilize and to come together and to be able to say, yes, of course, Bukele won with over 80% of, the vote, but he does not have a monopoly on civil society. And there are a lot of dissident voices. And, they're also saying history will attest, people are going to be able to see this, and also not just in history, not just in the future, but right now. And so, yeah, that is sort of a very more optimistic. I mean, I'm very much in support of them, and I appreciate the work that they're doing. And yeah, the question of democracy, I think, is one that's for the region, but also, I mean, globally, right? This is like sort of one of these crises that we're all experiencing at the moment is, what are the mechanisms that will ensure the protection of our rights and of representation of our interests. So to be determined, to be continued.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I think your research and all we talked today covers, from Middle East to Latin America, trends of raising of nationalism, violence, and all this political crisis, but also a lot of resistance. And as you mentioned, El Faro and many others that are fighting and keeping other narratives alive. So I would like to thank you very much for this conversation and say for our audience also to visit your website and see the great pictures and essays that you also have there. And on behalf of Security in Context, I would like to thank you and open also if you wanted to say final comments or.
Just keep up the good work. And thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you very much.